All right, so that notion of creating an idea by sort of understanding your subject matter, the form that underlies that subject matter, and how they're going to work together, how you're going to organize them together to create a particular idea. It's really important. It's kind of a big, general, maybe a little fuzzy right now to think about how you're actually going to make that happen. But now we're going to start looking a little bit more specifically at the rectangle that we're composing in and attendant compositional ideas that go with them that relate to that notion of form, subject matter, and content. So it all starts with the rectangle. Again, we've got to begin there. And if we think about the rectangle itself as having content, it should be part of that expressive idea that we have. So for example, here I've drawn two landscapes, right? One has a very horizontal rectangle. The other one is much more vertical. They're very different in terms of what they suggest. So if I was out west and I was doing a drawing, and what really interested me was just the breadth, just the horizontal breadth of what I was seeing out in the desert or something. I would probably choose this kind of format, sort of a long horizontal. That's going to support my idea better than something that's vertical. But if what I was really captivated by and wanted to express was, say, like the vertical sort of bigness of the sky out there, then this vertical format might be something that I would go for rather than the horizontal, because it's obvious, but it's amazing how many times people sort of miss this, because they're not thinking about the rectangle, or because they're just sort of working to the size of the paper or whatever. Really begin with your composition with that rectangle, as I've mentioned before, and like how is the shape of that going to support the particular idea that I want to convey? Right. So your format, shape of your rectangle, should be in the forefront of your mind as you begin. Okay. The second idea about the rectangle is that I wanted to give you is that there are certain areas of the rectangle that are a little bit more powerful in terms of their visual pull than others. So the center is there's a very strong visual pull to the center. We naturally sort of go to the middle of things. And so that's not a plus or a negative. It just depends on how you use it. I think there's some sort of thoughts out there, or I've heard people sort of talk about the fact that, well, you should never put anything in the center. Well, that's not really true. There are no real compositional rules. The only thing that you want to avoid in composition is to just not be aware of what you're doing. So if you're aware that you're putting something in the middle and you have purpose to it, then you can make it work. But you don't, through ignorance, don't want to put something in the middle that isn't an important part of your picture, because it's going to draw a lot of visual weight. And so if you put something like a head right in the middle of the picture, you just want to make sure that you do things around it to kind of get the viewer to sort of move their eye away from the middle. Like, we want the viewer to experience the whole rectangle, not just one little point in the middle. And so again, that visual draw to the center is something to be aware of and to think about as you're composing. This also brings up the next idea, which is the focal point. Usually in art, we create, or in composition, we create a hierarchy of interests. Things just are generally a little bit more interesting when we do that, when everything is not the exact same interest, but there's a hierarchy. Like, this is the most important, second, third, fourth, whatever. So the idea of creating a focal point, and here, a focal point can be created by a number of things. It can be, there's certain draw to certain kinds of subject matter. So like if you put, a human head and a tree in the same picture, unless you do something kind of unusual, we're going to look at the human head first, just because as subject matter, that has a little bit more visual pull. You can do things to sort of flip that, of course, but the first thing is to realize that there are certain things that have a little bit more visual weight just because of what they are. that's going to create a focal point. How you position it on the canvas, which I've already mentioned. So if I take a figure and I put it right in the middle, I've got something really interesting in terms of subject matter. I'm putting it in a really interesting place that has a lot of visual weight on the canvas, and so that's going to even create more of interest there. So those kinds of things start building a focal point or your primary area of interest in the graphic entity that you're creating. Let's see, just want to make sure I'm not forgetting anything. Okay. You can also do things to lead someone to the focal point. So you can have other lines that come in, obviously, and either pull into the focal point or point to the focal point. So, like if I shape these trees like this, that sort of bring me down into that sort of would even increase the focal point, even more. Repeating shapes and then having the focal point being different shapes because of that opposition. Then when we get into tone, things like contrast or pattern or whatever, those can all sort of help to create a stronger focal point. All right. The last thing I want to mention, and we can sort of use this as the same drawing, and that's the idea of with any composition, it's good to think of it as a landscape in that, so spatially. So, when we look at form, we're thinking a lot about sort of the two-dimensional consequence of what we're doing, in terms of shape and line and so forth. But there's also a spatial idea that we want to, be aware of. Like as we start sort of suggesting things, even though they may be very simple, we're starting to suggest space here. Things are overlapping, right? We're starting to suggest that there's some sort of depth there. And any composition, whether it's a still life or it has a figure, we want to think in terms of a foreground, middle ground, and run out of room here, a background. Okay, so it's just helpful to think about that. So here I've got the figure in the foreground, I move to the middle ground, the trees, and then the distant hills and the sun and so forth, that's in the background. So spatially, I'm kind of taking care of things. Where sometimes people run into trouble is, they might have something in the middle ground and kind of the background, but they don't do anything really in the foreground. So the foreground, this is the plane that we associate with being closest to us. So what's happening down here is really the foreground. So we want to think about doing something to help pull the viewer into our drawing or our painting and then take us to what's interesting. The interesting thing, or the focal point, could be in the foreground, could be in the middle ground, could be in the background. There's no absolute rule for it. But you want to make sure that you take care of those three kind of abstract planes of space and you don't leave one of them blank. All right. Okay, so that's good for now, and we'll pick up some other ideas in the next video.